This is Chief Justice Roberts of the United States Supreme Court. I will be addressing the decision in United States Forest Service v. Cowpasture River Preservation Association in the appended case today from my home due to the current COVID-19 pandemic. The issue before the Supreme Court is whether the U.S. Forest Service has the authority to grant rights of way under the Mineral Leasing Act through lands traversed by the Appalachian Trail within national forest. The respondents have argued that because the National Park System administers the trail under the Trails Act, that they therefore are the agency with the authority to grant the pipeline permits instead of the U.S. Forest Service. However, the petitioners have argued that while the trail is administered by the National Park Service, it is not the primary managing agency of the land. Also, there's an argument made that the pipeline would be placed 600 feet below ground, and that area would not be considered the trail. The pipeline has an entry and exit point that is on privately owned land. Only a small section of the pipeline will be running, and again, it would be running 600 feet under the trail. I do not like the precedent that it would set, nor the implications of an interpretation that would allow the Park Service jurisdiction and authority over all areas in which the trail runs through that would potentially have the impact of depriving private landowners and even some state and municipalities of rights, as well as severely limiting land uses for a vast amount of land. The Park Service administers the Appalachian Trail, but does that mean that they therefore have the right to limit or confiscate the rights of other public and private entities, possibly even land uses in some cities where the trail runs through a part of the city? For example, would giving them the sole authority to dictate regulation allow them to limit projects and land uses within a part of a city in which the trail runs? When legislation is written vague or broadly, it is more often than not to make legislation that is not overly restrictive and that does not become dated over time. I see the statute as giving them a loose overall administrative oversight for the trail, but it is really a network of the Forest Service, municipalities, and state agencies and other entities working collectively to manage the trail and surrounding areas. The trail can move and is a path. Therefore, if I have a footpath through my private property, does that then give me the right to control the land to the Earth's core? Other regulations dictate that my land is only mine up to a certain depth. For example, if there is a water table under my land, that water is not all mine to do with as I please. There are restrictions placed. It is also not unusual for the real property and land rights to be divided among separate entities. Therefore, I do believe that it is reasonable to say that the Forest Service has the authority to grant the pipeline permit.
Speaking as Justice Alito, ruling on whether the United States Forest Service has the authority under the Mineral Leasing Act and National Trail System Act to grant rights of way through national forest lands that the Appalachian Trail traverses. The ruling is yes, the United States Forest Service does have statutory authority to grant rights of way through the national forest lands that the Appalachian Trail traverses. Given that the pipeline will be located 600 feet below the surface, the idea that the Park Service would have control of not just the trail, but the area from the surface to the center of the earth would grant massive powers to Congress that the writers of the Trails Act would not have intended. The pipeline would be 600 feet below the trail and would not negatively impact the experience of the trail, which is the reason Congress originally established the system of federal lands and waters to, quote, provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means, as well as leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations." End quote. The pipeline would enter and exit on private lands and would not impair the trail or harm the enjoyment of future generations. Given its location, 600 feet below the surface, the Park Service does not have statutory authority to halt the development of this pipeline, which is necessary for the energy infrastructure of the nation and for economic development. Also, given that the area is a land traversed by a trail and is distinct from the land itself that is administered by the Park Service, the Forest Service does have statutory authority under the Mineral Leasing Act to grant this right-of-way. This opinion rests that the Trails Act does not transfer lands traversed by the Appalachian Trail into lands administered by the Park Service.
I'm Taylor Moore, and I'm representing Justice Clarence Thomas in the case regarding the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. As Justice Thomas, I am voting in favor of the construction of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which will be constructed underneath areas that the Appalachian Trail traverses. I have come to this conclusion through a reading of the acts and statutes relevant to this case, as well as through the thoughtful questions and comments presented by my peers on the bench during oral arguments. The reasoning for my decision is as follows. First, the land that the Appalachian Trail traverses is not solely or completely under the control of the U.S. Park Service. If there were no separation between the lands and the trails, then every land that the trails traversed would be under Park Service control. If this were the case, for example, trails that pass through cities and towns would make lands in those places under the control of the Park Service. However, this is not the case in those cities or those towns that have trails passing through them. They are not under the control or the authority of the Park Service in how they operate. This would be a misreading of the Trail Act, thus making the point that not all lands that the Appalachian Trail traverses should be considered Park Service lands. Second, much of the land that the trail traverses is not practically controlled by the Park Service. In many cases, the land is maintained and developed by land managing agencies and states. There is also no inherent reason as to why the trail is administered by the Park Service. The Secretary of the Interior designated this land to them, but could have done so to any federal agency of their choosing. Third, the issue may be considered moot altogether because the pipeline is set to be constructed 600 feet under the surface of the trail. Thus, it will not impact the trail itself or the experience of those who use it or who try to enjoy it. The pipe will enter and it will exit on private lands, so it will not impact the surface of the trail at any point. So in considering all relevant facts, information, and implications, I vote that the U.S. Forest Service has the authority under the Mineral Leasing Act to grant rights of way for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline to be constructed.
As Brett Kavanaugh, I'm to sign in favor of the United States Forest Service. While the Trail Act does give the National Park Service control over many trails, including specifically in this case, the Appalachian Trail, it does not give them control of the land around said trails. This still goes to the United States Forest Service. While the trail is there, the United States Forest Service does control all of the land around it, including the land under it where the pipeline is intended to go. Additionally, it would be erroneous to think that this land is controlled by the National Park Service, because then there would be many different lands, such as downtown Montgomery in Alabama, that would become parts of that would have their land controlled by the National Park Service. The Mineral Leasing Act provides the ability to grant right-of-way for pipelines such as the Atlantic Coast Pipeline from the United States Forest Service and I believe that they have the ability to do it in this case.
Hi. As Justice Gorsuch deciding on the case of Atlantic Coast Pipeline, LLC versus Cowpasture River Preference Association, I have voted yes, that the U.S. Forest Service does have the authority to grant rights of way under the Mineral Leasing Act through lands traversed by the Appalachian Trail within the National Forest. So, in regards to the opinion by Justice Alito, I believe that the trails do not follow under the jurisdiction of the administration of the Park Service when it is located 600 feet below the ground. The U.S. Forest Service should have the ability to give rights to the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, LLC. In concurrence with Justice Breyer, I voted in favor of this case as I believe that the economic benefits outweigh the environmental impact that this may have. State and local economies native to the Appalachian Trail would profit from the construction of the pipeline because it allows for local resources to be used and revenue to come in. Although there are some environmental impacts, they're not all harmful. The construction of this pipeline could instead be very valuable to the environment of the National Forest. It could eliminate the risk for leakage in the current pipe structure by replacing it with new, more reliable pipelines. And this issue also should not require congressional approval because the local economies will be the ones that are most impacted, and this will be something they experience firsthand. So having to get congressional approval is really just a bump in the road. And the construction of the pipeline is really important because it also has the potential to help the nation by immensely increasing energy supply. So overall, I agree that the U.S. Forest Service does have the authority to grant rights of way under the Mineral Leasing Act, and also that the economic impacts will be greater than the environmental.
Speaking as Justice Breyer on the ruling of whether the United States Forest Service has the authority under the Mineral Leasing Act and National Trail System Act to grant rights of way through national forests such as the Appalachian Trail traverses, ruling is yes. I believe the United States Forest Service does have statutory authority to grant right of way to the national forest lands for the Appalachian Trail traverses. I voted yes, but not for the majority reasoning that we do not have jurisdiction of the pipeline because it is 600 feet underground, but because of the economic and environmental benefits that were presented in the oral arguments. The economic benefits of constructing the pipeline are projected to have a large impact on the community. An approximate of 17,000 jobs for skilled workers and over $1.8 billion in wage and fringe benefits are projected within this project in the local community. And even though these are temporary jobs, it's a significant impact at the local level. At the state level, there's an estimated $2.7 billion in economic activity with an additional $25 million in state government that will be generated. With all of these numbers, that's a huge benefit to local economy, and it's just another hump that Congress would have to approve if we push this over to congressional approval. So this is why I do not believe that it needs to be pushed over to Congress, and I did vote yes. Another reason is environmental factors. Obviously, there are some risks with putting in a new pipeline, but at the same time, the current pipes that are in there are eroding, and it is dangerous to leave those in there. So putting in a new pipeline is safer, and trees go through growth cycles, and obviously forests do too. And so it is better to do some clearing and help the trees that are overgrown have more room for growth. And obviously it's not an ideal situation, but there is room for the forest to rebuild itself. So with those environmental factors and economic factors all leading to the benefit of the local economy and the local and the state government. I voted yes.
Hi, I'm Justice Elena Kagan, and I'm voting against the construction of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. I am voting no. The U.S. Forest Service does not have the authority to grant rights of ways under the Mineral Leasing Act through lands traversed by the Appalachian Trail within the national forest. Advocates and the legal team in favor of the pipeline argued that the U.S. Forest Service has the authority to grant the necessary rights of way, asserting that although the Park Service is charged with the overall administration of the Appalachian Trail, the actual lands traversed by the trail within national forests remain under the jurisdiction of the Forest Service. I disagree with the declarations made by the petitioners of the case before us because I agree with the assertion that no federal agency can grant right-of-way for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline because the Appalachian Trail is part of the National Park System. Lands within the National Park System are exempt from the typical process of approving rights of ways for the extraction of minerals and resources under 30 U.S. Code 185. The Mineral Leasing Act makes it absolutely clear that it extends the rights for oil and gas pipelines to all federal lands. The fact that the Appalachian Trail is within the boundaries of the National Park System defers destructive action being applied to this land by the consent of the Forest Service alone. The land that is under administration is considered as a part of the National Park System, which means these pipelines cannot have the rights to those federal lands. These acts and pieces of legislation were created to protect the environment and preserve the natural lands of our nation. We can all understand the need for pipelines throughout the country to transport oil and gas to refineries for the processing of these materials into products we use every day. Despite the importance of these constructions, it is all imperative that the natural lands we have left stay in place. These resources are finite, and once we run out, we will be forced to seek alternative measures. All in all, the deforestation of these lands would also be disruptive to animal habitats, as well as disrupt natural processes such as the water cycle. I base my decision on the provisions outlined within the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920. Only Congress can approve the crossing of the desired pipeline.
I am Justice Ginsburg, and I am voting no to the question of whether or not the United States Forest Service has the authority under the Mineral Leasing Act to grant rights of way for land traversed by the Appalachian Trail within national forests. I would like to start by assessing the merits of this case. The Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 clearly states that the Secretary of Interior or an appropriate agency head, which in this case would be the United States Forest Service, has the authority to grant rights of ways for construction of pipelines through federal lands or lands owned by the United States. However, this land does not include land within the National Park System, which the Appalachian Trail is a part of. The majority opinion in this case is since the pipeline is being built 600 feet underground and will not affect the use of the trail, it is not in the jurisdiction of the National Park System, and therefore the U.S. Forest Service has the authority to grant the right-of-way. However, at this time, I would like to cite a separate Supreme Court case, New Jersey v. Delaware, which addresses this issue. In New Jersey v. Delaware, New Jersey wanted to build a natural gas transfer facility on the New Jersey side of the Delaware River. However, Delaware refused to grant this permit because some of the construction would require the dredging of underwater lands in Delaware's jurisdiction. New Jersey issued the permit anyway, citing a 1905 compact between the states which gave New Jersey control of the land. However, the court held in a 6-2 opinion that Delaware acted within its authority in denying the permit since the construction would require unreasonable uses of the river and soil within Delaware's jurisdiction. Now, since the construction of the pipeline will be underneath the Appalachian Trails, it will require the destruction as part of of the trail during construction. Since it will require the destruction of the trail, it does fall within the authority of the National Park System. Therefore, the U.S. Forest Service does not have the authority to grant the right-of-way. At this time, I would also like to address the environmental impact this trail would have. Building the pipeline will leave a negative environmental impact. According to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, the pipeline will leave impacts on steep slopes and adjacent water bodies, as well as other aquatic resources. Furthermore, it will destroy forest vegetation as well as affect the habitats of endangered species living in the area. Overall, the construction of this pipeline goes against the Mineral Leasing Act put in place by Congress and has negative impacts on the environment that could be prevented. Therefore, I vote no to the question at hand.
Hello, this is Justice Sotomayor, and on Atlantic Coast Pipeline LLC versus Cowpasture River Preference Association, I voted that no, the U.S. Forest Service does not have the authority to grant rights-of-way under the Mineral Leasing Act through land traversed by the Appalachian Trail within national forests. I voted this way for policy as well as environmental reasons. First, the U.S. government set up these national forests to be as well as national parks to be protected by our government. The U.S. Congress is the only body that is supposed to approve construction through these national parks and lands, and we should not and cannot let other agencies push their way into protected lands. In fact, it is other agencies not tied to the government that really started harming the environment with fossil fuel emissions. In addition, just because the pipeline is below the land does not mean that it is not property of our park. It is our responsibility to protect the surface, trees, and air, and ground where the tree's roots grow deep. Also, in terms of environment, it is very risky to construct a natural gas pipeline, as a leak could have very harmful effects to your environment, as well as the species in this park. And especially this kind of risky construction should not happen at a national park where the lands are supposed to be protected. In addition, we're trying to move away as a nation and world from the use of non-renewable resources and natural gas, so this pipeline would just halt that and reverse the progress we're trying to make. In all, even though this has major environmental impacts, we should not let any other agency be able to approve or disapprove construction through national parks, land that should be protected by the environment.